All right. So, physLight, the USD guys a moment ago talked about metrics, right? Putting units to how big things are in a set, how long things take. So, my angle today is how much light do you have in a scene? How bright is a pixel? So, this is a sketch that Anders made. This is work that, was with me for 10 years. And I've bothered a lot of people about this inside White Hat while I was still there, and now I'm bothering everybody about this. So, so the relevance of this is twofold. One side is, the classic thing that we do in VFX. You have to put a monkey in place of Andy, and you want the picture of the monkey and the picture of the background to look the same. The other case is you work for IKEA or anybody that has to do a product placement or a virtual prototype. And you want to make sure that the picture you make in the computer is as close as you need it to be to a photograph you would take in real life. And so you will use a renderer, maybe one of these, maybe a different one, like this is just a long list, and I just don't have any pretense of completion here. It's just a sum. And Marcos said that you make a picture like this, and there's a bunch of pieces as to what this means. If you're into being a little bit more abstract about your mathematics, you want to say that there's paths instead of single bounces. And so this is one of the this is rendering, right? It's the most studied thing of computer graphics. So I'm not going to talk about that. I will only talk about two things: what's going to happen on the first term and the last term in terms of the magnitude of the numbers. The meaning, thousands and thousands of papers of this. So I made a word cloud because I did not step out of 2011. And I made a word cloud because I wanted to focus on one word. So when you talk about light, you need to be able to say loosely that certain things are, have more light or look more to you than others. And so we use this word brightness when we want to say, it's brighter. It's one of these, how you define a set, right? There's certain fundamental concepts that are very difficult to explain in terms of others. So brightness is the plain English word that says it's brighter. And So to make pictures, you need cameras in real life. You need renderers in the virtual world. And renderers mimic, at the moment in which you're going from there's a flow of energy coming to the image plane, and they're trying to put a number into a pixel, they do something like this. And I'll talk for a second as to what that gray equation is, and then we'll talk later about the fact that they need to make red pixels and green pixels and blue pixels if you want to see an image in color. And so there's also a part about color later. But the slide wanted to focus on the fact that there are a lot of different cameras in the world, and they have very different purposes in terms of what the numbers they put in the, when you get a file out of devices that include one of those, there's specific numbers in these files. And the magnitude of those is important that we understand exactly what that is. So first equation, imaging ratio. This thing called Ki. So you have a pixel value, you're trying to determine what to write in your pixel. You have radiance coming to you. That is how much energy is flowing to a ray of light that's coming onto the film back. And you want something that behaves like a camera. So, if you have a longer shutter time, you're going to get a brighter picture. If you have a smaller aperture that is a bigger aperture number, you're going to have a darker picture. If you have a higher exposure index, you're going to get a brighter picture still. And so all these things need to be linear, so clearly the math works out like that. But there is one last constant that scales all of this so that you get a number there that we want to understand how big that is. So we will see 3 subscripts on all the letters in the talk. One is lambda. That means we're looking at spectral things. So depending on the wavelength, there's different values for these things. That's sometimes is handy because it's what life does. And so if you know that your model mimics physics and reality very accurately, you know that chances are high your equations just flow out to, have numbers that reflect that, but sometimes this is too specific, and so there's this idea of radiometric that, how much energy as the energy of the physics is flowing through your picture, and you can measure that. And we use the E subscript to say that. Or the important one for people that make pictures is how bright does it look to a person? And that one is called photometric, and it's this idea that our eyes, when they look, when you feel brightness, and you have this sensation of things being brighter than others, you don't feel things being brighter of all colors by the same relative amount. And so this V lambda thing was derived in the late 20s and the 30s to actually respond in a way that is very similar to what humans see, up to the point where every human is different and all of our eyes see slightly different images. So, the reason it took me 10 years is because the number of leaps of faith and just, relaxing, absorbing, and moving forward that you need to do when you do this is unbelievable. And so we'll talk about the scars in a moment. But if you believe in such a thing as a standard human, the standard human perceives brightness proportional to that V lambda thing. And so if we want to talk about pictures, it's appropriate that we talk about this underbar V thing that is the brightness. It's approximately the shade of gray in a black and white picture from panchromatic film, if you know what that is. So I've already said that. So this is our equation. I just added subscript V to the pixel and the radiance, which is now luminance. So there's luminance and there's the brightness of a pixel. Think of it as take your pixel color, put it in XYZ, look at the Y value. That's where we want it to be. Okay, so now for a change of perspective, now for something completely different. So in a real camera, you measure a quantity called exposure. That is how much light got there for the amount of time that the shutter was open. And so we have a pixel. It has a certain brightness. It relates to sensitivity, to the exposure index, as we said. Proportionally, ideally, if you double the light, the pixel is twice as bright. And so you can measure the exposure, and then you have a number in the pixel. There's a gain there to be applied so that the units of lux seconds you have on one side become 0.18 or whatever on the image. And so you call this sensor gain, and there's a standard for digital cameras that says a whole thing that I wrote there. Don't read it. If it's important to you, you can look at the recording, or I'll share the slides. But effectively, it's a very simple formula. The formula says if the pixel is 0.18, this is the formula that tells you what the sensitivity was. Okay, that's great. We can do that. So put it together, cancel out some things, you get that the gain is 1.8. Exact. Like, this is lovely. For once, we get a clean, simple number that we can remember. This is result 1. So let's move to result 2. A renderer is in a fantastic place to measure exposure because it has everything to the dot in its hands to compute the value. And if things are moving, you can just say that your shutter is open for, 100th of a second, so you multiply it by 100th, what have you. The irradiance that is, or the illuminance that is what you're measuring when you write your, algorithm by the book, and that's the value. The illuminance, because we're going to reason about things like, F numbers in lenses, you want to rate that to how much light your lens is emitting in front of the renderer. And so there's an equation in the classic optics books that works out like that. We believe it. There's this thing called the F number, that's what you said. There's this thing called the cosine fourth law. That is, it's a thing. And if you ever wrote a light tracer, you know what the cosine fourth is. Otherwise, we just take it out because we have an advantage. Ki, the ratio between how much light you get and the value of the pixel needs to be the same across the whole picture. Interestingly, that means it needs to be the same in the center. In the center, cosine fourth is 1.0. Again, exact. So we don't need it. Awesome. But there's transmission losses because lenses are not transparent things. They're quite opaque. And it turns out that they're opaque in a way that depends well, quite opaque. They're a little opaque. And it depends on the wavelength. And so lenses, all glass is a little colored, and it's a little colored in different ways. And so the gray is the ISO standard lens, that is a thing. The white are measurements from some quality Zeiss lenses. They do lose light. There is no lens that has a flat response in the spectral sense. And so if you go and read, again, if you go back to the standard says this is what it works out on, which you might observe has nothing to do with what I talked about up to now, whatsoever. So you can break it apart. There's a whole bunch of correction factors. There is bulk transmittance, which is really makes sense because it's not a spectral thing. And then there's other factors that are just difficult to live with. But eventually, the last page of the standard says it's 0.65, 1 over n squared, the incoming illuminance. So, okay. The number there is not meant to be accurate, that's 0.82 or whatever. It's just the product of the others. And we intend it to be whatever precision you're working with, floats or doubles, you compute that, and that's what you get. So now we put it all together, and I'm going to move quickly through this because I want to make time for better stuff later in the deck. And you put it all together, cancel whatever. Finally, you get to Ki being 1 over 67 point something. And this is result 2. Says I, today, for my current understanding of this, again, long work, many scars, that I think this is what we should be doing. I would love to hear from everybody that dissents on this, because this is very difficult and there's plenty of dark corners to get yourself into. So one thing that we'll bring up is that it's slightly brighter than what it seems that the digital camera standard is saying, and it's ever so slightly twice as brighter than what Ansel Adams says you should expose to. Sorry, darker. I'll take a pause here and just, again, breathe and move on. However, all jokes aside, it is a simple, clean expression that has a very clear derivation that it is possible, says I, easy, but, I see this was just 10 years, come on. We could live with this. Like the precision that is, the error that is introduced by this approximation is much smaller than the control you have on any other parts of the process, be that physical media or production of digital sensors, that it's probably okay. I'm sharing with you my scars. So this is just the relevant papers that I read to put this thing together, which I've classified roughly in, what they say and why. There is another document that explains this in unbelievable detail that has all the bibliography. So beyond the joke, don't read too much into this. But Anders, which is one of the authors on this work, has been working hard with the USD people to put this stuff into physLight as an applied schema. So applied schema 1, we can make the bulk behavior of a camera with a lens in a world in which lenses are simple objects and there's no flare and other advanced effects. And there's a schema that he's proposed that is currently under review in the USD repository, GitHub. So that was camera. Lights. Lights are much easier. Lights are really, they just flow super easily. So when you have a light, you have fundamentally 3 components. You have a thing that gives, that pushes out energy. Then the energy that comes out doesn't all come out in all possible directions in the same ways, because you want to have spotlights, you're going to have very broad lights. And so there's an angular distribution that says that sideways there's maybe less light than there is right in front. And then there's textures, because when you look at the light, which is important when you have reflected, you don't normally see lights directly in pictures, but what you do see is reflections of lights and things that are, shiny. And so the reflection is important, it is accurate, and so oftentimes on the face of the light there's a texture, and this is how you would represent that. And so to relate the classic, this is the classic computer graphics light. There's nothing new here. It's just a slightly decomposed formulation that is appropriate for most lights. There are lights that are a little bit more complicated than this, but on most days, a local source looks like this. So it has these three things. You can normalize that away and then say that you want to express the power of this light as luminous power, which has an SI unit called lumen. And the reason to use lumen is because we have decided that when you go and buy a light, the datasheet tells you it puts out such and such lumens. And so now you can relate a thing in the computer to a thing that you can measure with a datasheet or a tape measure or a light meter, or this is good, right? The normalization is easy. The only thing that might look slightly computationally intensive is averaging the texture, but averaging the texture is done by the texture unit for you. You just get the coarser SMIP level. You just have the texture average computed. Good to go. This is like, very simple Italianization code, and then on hit, you just have one scalar to multiply your classic light to get a physLight light. Same thing for image-based lighting. So this is the case where you have a big giant sphere around your scene that pushes light everywhere. Same story, I'm not going to repeat it, but fundamentally there's instruments called light meters that come in, for industrial use, for photography use. You use those, you get a number out, put the number back in, normalize in this slightly different ways, but fundamentally same concept. You get a thing out. But because we know how camera works for IBLs, you can do the other thing. You can say, well, I took the picture with a camera, I can now go back and infer what was happening on the scene directly from the photograph. I don't need to go forward like I do for a synthetic local light. And so we will soon, again, at WEDA we have put together a tool called HDR Merge that is meant to take several photos at different exposure lengths, and so to get the full dynamic range of a scene in real life. And we will try soon to merge it into rawtoaces to get IBLs that flow through this inverted equation cleanly and get you back honest, reliable, as if it was there on the day, amounts of energy flowing through your scene. Great. This will also go in USD Lux if Anders's work gets ever approved. There are some very small details to pin down, but the bulk of it is, for this one, super easy. We're just saying this is the unit and moving on with our lives. But this is black and white pictures. So what happens with color? So, when you have lights, you can walk up to them with a spectral light meter and get a sense of, by wavelength, how much light is coming out of them. So how much does this change the renders you make compared to your classic RGB lights in a digital scene? So in this picture, you see a render of a young version of Will Smith, and then on the right-hand side, you have a Macbeth chart. They're cut in half down the middle, each single one of the patches on the chart and the character. And on the left-hand side, you should see that it's a little tiny bit greener than on the right-hand side. And the quality of that match depends on how the light is well approximated by your theory of what RGB means in your renderer. And in some cases, it's quite different. Yeah, you can see this. In some cases, it's quite different. Like, it's very hard for certain spectral distributions to make RGB correspondences that work well. And note that the problem is not that half of the face is green. The problem is that if you look at the patches, some of them match super well while others don't match at all. And so you can't easily color correct for this if you don't do color-aware spectral corrections and weird stuff. The camera has a similar situation. So if you take the camera and apply the equation I just said, you get a passable match in the brightness, which is pretty good, but you get a relatively poor match in the color side. Chroma is not very good. So you know how we talked about this, right? We said there's only 3 subscripts that we're going to use. And we said that there's this integration equation that you use to go from the spectral situation to the photometric situation. Well, what if we have a few more? So what if we said that, as much as V is how you see brightness, R is how you see red, And so, you know, there's red and green and blue, and I made up 3 new quantities called reminous and greenminous and bluminous. And so now we have irreminence and agreeminence. So I did want to be playful about this, but there is a point here. We usually say in parlance that there's nits flowing through our scene, but there aren't. This is very important. When you're doing RGB work, the red sensitivity, the green sensitivity, the blue sensitivity will not give you numbers that have anything to do with photometric amounts. They will give you, you know, reminous number and greenminous numbers. And that depends on the device. The one camera you have will respond in a way to light, and a camera from a different manufacturer or a different model will respond in a slightly different way. So with Kimball, several years ago, we designed this thing here called the lightsaber. It's a light source, the lamp, with a collimation lens and a thing to adjust the color temperature of the light coming out. Heatsink gets hot, and then it has a little holder for bandpass filters that only let through about 10 nanometers worth of light at a time. And then at the front, it has a little mount that you can screw on so that you can attach cameras very carefully. And then you call him, and he mounts your camera onto it and gives you a bunch of pictures like these. And this is how the sensor responds to light without any intervening glass. It's the honest, straight-out, naked sensor response, which is nice because there's none of that tau lambda situation going on here. So you compare that with readings out of a spectrometer, and you know, you get a matrix. The matrix is super well behaved, is strong diagonal, no dominant. You invert it with whatever you like. That there is no way to mess up this inversion. And then out you get curves. And in particular, here you see 2 different 5D Mark IVs measured, and you can see that the item to item manufacturing spread is actually there. Obviously, depending on the cameras you're working with and you know how expensive they are and things, this is controlled more or less tightly, but they're not all completely identical. So if you do that and you use that to make your render, your colors are a lot closer. And again, all the colors land together. It's not like a couple get better and the other ones move out. So again, Anders has proposed a new thing, another piece of an applied schema for spectral sensitivity of those cameras that completes the picture. But, you know, I used to work on a renderer that was spectral, so all of this was super easy for me. But most people have an RGB renderer. And so what does that mean? I think that to show you what's the difference in action, so it's just an accuracy problem. Like the question here is the RGB image of, you know, a scene for which you have spectral data going to be any darker or brighter than your RGB render, or is it going to be, you know, chromatically shifted? I will just show you the chroma analysis today, just because, you know, I'm already 23 minutes in and I was supposed to talk for 15. But there's an equivalent analysis you can do about the brightness that is, it's identical, like, you know, things move in strange ways. So let's say that you have a piece of material here, and this is a slightly thicker line, and that you're looking at a scene, you know, into a corner so that you're able to observe several amounts of bounces of this spectrum onto itself before it reaches the camera. I have messed with the amplitude of the curves to keep it at a constant integral so that they all would give you materials of the same brightness. This is, of course, because I'm just looking at the color of it, and I'm looking at chroma, discarding luma. So I'm keeping a constant luma for everything we're going to see here forward. This is not what the renderer needs to do, but, you know, either you look at color or you look at brightness. So you can do this for several different curves. They all behave in slightly different ways, but the thing is the shape of the curve picks up contrast, and it just becomes, you know, less stable. It tends to concentrate towards the peaks and move and, you know, flatten out to the bottom where it sits flat. And so, where it's in, you know, in the lows. And so, again, same concept here. On the left-hand side, you have a spectral render of what this would look like. On the right-hand side, you take the spectrum, go to RGB for the first square at the top, and then going down is just RGB onto itself. And you can see that depending on the color, the behavior in terms of how much they drift away from one another is actually completely different. But it is difficult, you know. I would like to show you a few more spectra, and I'm not going to show you all these because it's just too qualitative as a thing, right? So I made chromaticity plots of what these things are. So if you don't know what this diagram is, there's this horseshoe shape around is pure color. So these are colors that come only from one wavelength, being emitting energy, and everything else being zero emission. And then in the middle, you would have every possible other colors that comes from mixing them. And so I plotted the various squares we had before as little dots. And on the left-hand side, you see what happens if you do this, you know, the spectral multiplication. And on the right-hand side, you see what happens if you do this in sRGB space. But the cool kids today want to do ASCG, so I've also put down an ASCG plot for you. And in a second, you'll see that this is actually more interesting than it looks. But because tracking what these points do is complicated, I've used lines to merge them. And then to make it a little bit more obvious what's going on, I've also added two triangles. The dashed one is the sRGB gamut, where the primaries of an sRGB display would be in this diagram, and the bigger solid line gamut is for ASCG. So the first observation you have is that, you know, the three corners of the gamut that you're using kind of work as attractors for the orbits of these you know, bounce on self operation. So I made the paths longer to make this a little bit more obvious. So this is now plotting 8 bounces, you know, 0 to 8 bounces across. And I've added a few more curves, and it turns out that in some cases the behavior of these orbits is actually quite interesting, and it's really not what you might expect. Like, there is some curvature that you expect that has to come from, you know, the fact that there is an exponential behavior and the fact that it's a linear projection, but these, you know, boomerang style, you know, starts green and then becomes orange kind of behaviors are difficult to predict, and RGB just cannot do it. It is fundamentally impeded by the fact that you're projecting from doing these shapes. Or there is another one in the green at the top that, you know, goes towards more green and then changes its mind and goes towards red. It's just complicated. However, because this is the chromaticity diagram, the distance of 2 points on that diagram doesn't mean that your sense of difference chroma it corresponds to that distance. It's not a very conducive space to reason about how much color difference you have. So I printed it on a different space that is similar to CIE LAB. This is called OKLab, and it was specially optimized to be even more accurate than LAB in predicting distances. So on this plot, you actually can say that, you know, within reasonable accuracy for the standard observer and a million other these caveats, 2 points that are at the same distance look to you as if their color is the same difference. You know how I said this is all constant brightness. Now, it turns out that if you want to do this well, you need to take brightness into account, and I took it out. So you need to take these plots with a grain of salt. But aside from that, you know, things look complicated. And if you plot more curves, they look even more complicated. So RGB renders work, and they make pictures, and, you know, the entire industry make pictures with RGB renderers that composite fine. But there is error in there, and if we want to agree on having the same numbers, we need to be careful in how we do this. And that's the message. At Weta, they've used physLight to do almost 50 movies by now, so I'll just leave you with a reel. In the reel, there's a couple of shots that are not physLight, just to, you know, keep you guys attentive. Find them out, and I'll give you a golden ticket if you find all of them. Disclaimer, I will not. Oh, there's audio. Oh, no, I don't have an... oh, yeah, actually, sorry. Yes. What's that, sorry? I have it. Well, anyways, it's for the pictures, right? The audio is not important.
In the presence of evil.
Avengers! I'm about to do something terrible.
If we are to die, then we will die fighting, all as one.
All right, thank you. Yeah, there's a question right there.
I think we only have time for one question or so, because then we're going to go to
Sorry,
break.
I went way long.
Yeah, just a very quick question about,
Yes.
I mean, you showed the difference in the absolute spectrum and the spectral differences. What's the perception of the human? I mean, is there an understanding of exactly at what level the human perceives this, that it's important that you need to measure this for the production?
No, well, yeah, that's why I was going to that last different plotting in OCLAB, right? If you measure the distance on the OCLAB plane and you believe in their equations, which, I mean, in their defense, they try to be as accurate as they possibly can with a simple formula, the perceived difference is, you know, proportional to the distance, straight Euclidean distance of the points in the plot for the standard observer. And, you know, for my eyes or your eyes or David's eyes, or, you know, they're all different. So it is a very difficult subject to treat exactly once you get the human into the loop, except if you measure the one human.
I was going to say, like, one thing that, maybe I should use the mic. It may not be so much about the human observing the differences, but more about trying to cancel out differences between different vendors, different cameras, different things, such that you can reason about all of these units or all of these things as in one system, right? That's, I think, more the fundamental thing to think about.
One of the reasons for doing physLight was to, you know, that integration problem, right? You have Andy, you need to put in Monkey. So if you have good acquisitions of the materials, you need to match the camera used on set for principal photography in the render so that the colors actually turn out to be the same, you know, the right brightness, but also the right chroma. And so this, you know, the whole, you know, measuring the light spectrally, measuring the camera's spectral response really helps tying it all together.
Okay, thank you, Luca. We're going to take a quick break.